Shanghai, etc. We also have some online programs like big data and artificial intelligence, digital transformation, and design thinking. So this is for the part-time programs. On the other hand, we do have full-time programs like the Global MBA. So this is a one-year program, very international. Actually, 90% of the cohort is international people. And during this 1 year, we have 2 international fields, like field trips, in which participants, they go to different European destinations, and some examples can be as well London, Luxembourg, Amsterdam. So this is some examples of what has been done in the past. And last but not least, there is also a Master of Science, which is Master of Science in International Hospitality Management. This last one is a 3-year track. And so that's it for me about the presentation of the programs and the school, and I will let Professor Thomas introduce himself.
Yes, thank you so much, Natalia, for the introduction. So I'm Thomas Kude. It's a really pleasure to be here, to meet you, to share some of the things we do in the programs with you. So I have been an associate professor with ESSEC for 5 years, I think now. I work in the information systems group of ESSEC's faculty, and I teach on and do research on topics related to digitalization. Some of the things that I'm particularly interested in include digital platforms and agile transformations. And so I do research on these topics. I publish on these topics. I work with companies and organizations on these topics. And I also teach in some of the programs that Natalia was talking about, but also others. So across the board of all the programs that ESSEC offers, I'm involved with some of these topics. And I'm also, one of the courses that I particularly like to teach is the one in the Global MBA. And in the Global MBA, I'm teaching a class called Digital Disruption. And today, I would like to give you a few glimpses into what we do in this course, and also link this to some of the things that I was mentioning just now that I'm particularly interested in related to digital platforms. And we're going to focus on the digital transformation of established organizations that face digital disruption. And we're going to take a perspective on digital platforms, which are relevant in multiple ways, some of which may be surprising also. So this is what we do. And so if you have questions, some of you are on the Zoom call, some of you may be online. So if you want to, if you would like to ask some questions, you can use the chat. We either gonna answer them right away, or toward the end, there will be time for you to ask questions if you would like to. So, okay, so digital disruption. Let's start with some classic American companies that you see here. So these logos, some of them at least, might look familiar to you. So this is long-standing American brands that have all been struggling. That's what they have in common. They have all been struggling in the past decades in one way or the other. And they're all still around. Even Blockbuster is still around. There's still one store somewhere in the US. But they're all still there, but they are like a much less relevant, and they're a minor version of what they used to be, like the retail giants, Toys R Us and Sears and Kodak, of course, in the photography business, and Blockbuster in video rental. So, well, these are still around. Some others aren't. So you may know that out of the US out of the Fortune 500 companies, only like around 50 are still around, right? So lots of organizations get disrupted. So what happens to these organizations? So among others, this is what happens, right? So these are players that entered the game. So again, very familiar logos, probably even more familiar, of course. And this is the companies that really disrupted the business models of those that we have seen before. Like when you take Amazon as an example for disrupting retailing, what Toys R Us and Sears have been doing for many, many years. Take Netflix as an example that disrupts the entertainment industry, and Blockbuster were the main victim here. And take Apple and Google, which disrupted, of course, many fields. But for the example that we had just now, when you take photography, which really took a hit from the introduction of smartphones. So as we will see in this talk, and what we also discuss in detail in my classes, is that these are platform companies, right? And we'll see later on what that exactly means. And what these platform companies do is that they enter these industries with a new business model, a platform business model, and they also build on digital technology, such as these names, these buzzwords that you see here. So this is a list of technology that you probably all have heard of, and I'm not going to go into detail now for any of these, but we do this in my classes, of course. We talk about this technology. So this is, and this is not a complete list of current technology, but this is among the things that new technology companies and also large technology companies build on, use to disrupt industries through new business models. And this is particularly challenging for established, long-standing companies like the ones that we have seen before. And there's several reasons for this. And so some of them include that established companies may be successful with what they do. They may not see the urge or the need for adopt some of these technologies and think of new business models. They may just be fine. They may be relatively comfortable in their market position. And once they realize that there is a disruption happening, it may simply be too late, right? And they may also lack the foresight or the skills in some examples to the capabilities to see how some of this technology may, in fact, change the core business of what they do. So this is some of the reasons why this is so challenging for established organizations. And in my digital disruption class, that's why one of the key questions that we're trying to address, one of the key mysteries that we're trying to solve together with the participants in our discussions, in our group work, in our case discussions, is how can established organizations thrive, be successful in the context of digital disruption? And so we've seen just now, I've mentioned some reasons why this may be difficult for established organizations. And an important element of this is that for established organizations, digital transformation, digital disruption does not build on a green field. So it may be easier for digital native organizations, born digital organizations, to address a new customer need with some new technology. This may be harder for established organizations because they have had technology management in place for a long time, and this needs to be transformed. And this is exactly what we look at in our case, and what I would also like to share with you now is the fact that established organizations, on the left-hand side, you see IT management. So this is what organizations have been doing all along, right? Established organizations always had their IT in place. They always had their enterprise systems that they had running in the organization. But there's one key difference to what is happening today, is that in the old days, the task of IT, of technology management, was to support business, right? So the idea was that we have our business side that creates value in one way or the other for clients, and what IT does is to support business in doing so. It was what we call a secondary function, a supportive function. And this has dramatically changed, right? Because of new technology, so the arrow that you see in the middle, now organizations really need to become digital. And what does that mean? On the bottom, you see digital practices. So at the micro level, that means that organizations need to change their operating model, the way they work, the practices they have. They need to become digital. And the reason for this is that digital technology in established organizations moves from a secondary supportive role to be really center stage, to be really at the core of what these organizations do. Often product or service itself is digital, or at least a core part of it is becoming digital. Like as we've seen for the examples earlier that disrupted the established organizations. So that's the upper, and in order to be successful in doing that, these established organizations have to adopt digital practices. They have to become a technology, a software company themselves. If you take like an established automotive manufacturer as an example, that which had like enterprise systems in place, so they had their IT management, right? They were concerned with questions of outsourcing, IT governance, to best provide their enterprise system to the business side. Now it's really different. Now these are actually technology companies or even software companies, right? Because that takes such a large part of what they do or for what a car is these days, right? So that's the part on digital practices, the way organizations work, the operating model that is changing because of new technology. And on top of that, at the macro level, where you see digital ecosystems, we also see changes in the business model. And here the key change is that organizations are not monolithic entities anymore, which had like some suppliers and then sold something to clients. No, nowadays in this digital age, organizations are embedded in what we call digital ecosystems. And we'll see in more detail what that means. But the rough idea is that an organization does not exist in an island, but as an island, but has to interact with other organizations. Organizational boundaries are increasingly blurring, and ecosystems form around what we call digital platforms. So that's kind of the framework of what I would like to share with you today, and also the framework of some of my courses at ESSEC, and in particular the digital disruption course that I teach in the Global MBA every year that I was mentioning earlier. And what we do there in this digital disruption course is we spend some time on discussing, I guess, a baseline, what IT management is in the first place. And then we talk a lot about new technology, and I've given you some ideas of what we talked about earlier. So this is the second part. And then we spend quite a bit of time using case studies, using in-class discussions to think about what it means for an established organization to introduce digital practices in terms of an agile transformation, and also to find the organization's place in a digital ecosystem, which, as we will see, could mean becoming the central organization, the central actor in terms of a digital platform, or becoming a complementary actor that provides add-on functionality or uses a platform to get in touch with its clients. So what I would like to do next is to tell you a bit more about what we do in this context of digital ecosystems on the one hand, and digital practices on the other hand. And so let's start with digital ecosystems. So and let me start by giving you an example to clarify what I mean by that. So I take let's take the Internet of Things and smart home as an example. That's something that we're all somewhat familiar with, something that we can relate to. So we know more or less what it is and how it works. And let's take I'm German originally, so let's take Bosch as an example, which is, as you know, which is a German company, which, among many other things, they're also automotive suppliers, for example, but also has for a long time manufactured devices, home appliances, right? And nowadays, they more and more they are in this process of an established company in their digital transformation, and increasingly they try to provide solutions for smart home. For smart homes, and you see on the right-hand side, you see some examples. They have like certain devices for heating, for indoor climate, for security, and for many others. And they entered this market. To some extent, they try to become the entry point, the hub, like the platform, and that has the main interaction point with customers. But of course, in this space, they are not alone. There's others that are already around, right? And this is some very well-known examples that you're of course aware of. So on the top left, so this is US examples in this case. So in the top left, you see Apple with Apple Home, and on the top right, you see Amazon Alexa, and on the bottom, you see Google Nest. So all three American examples that this American tech companies that are active in this space as well. And so this is very interesting what's happening. So for Bosch as an established company that is really seeing what we discussed earlier, that that's not like a monolithic entity anymore. They don't just sell washing machines to their customers and that's it. No, they exist in an ecosystem. They have to think of what their position is. Should we try to make our devices compatible with all these other players, or should we really try to be the platform owner, the central or actor in this ecosystem, which can be a very beneficial position, but at the same time, of course, is very hard given the competition. And so this is actually a very interesting industry. Without going too much into detail right now, it's interesting because for some time we thought that the smartphone would be like the natural entry point to our smart home. So Apple was, if you take these three actors again, Apple was kind of in a pole position in a way. But then it turned out that smart speakers are another way to control your smart home, which brought like Amazon and Google in even better market position, and now Apple is trying to catch up with their own speakers. So there's lots of interesting things that are happening in this industry. And another interesting element is that some of these, the three that we've seen just now, and also other technology companies, but also device manufacturers, actually came together to form a standard, which is called Matter, to make all these devices and systems compatible, which is something that we actually rarely see in this space, because usually we have this winner-take-all dynamics where organizations, platforms would try to be the central organization in this space. But maybe because it was so difficult for the established players to become the single market entry for the single entry point for customers, that may be a reason why this alliance was formed to bring together these organizations. So all this to say that to illustrate how a very traditional established organization like Bosch, that is probably on a good way in its digital transformation and has entered this market space, now has to face a situation where they really have to think of their place in a digital ecosystem, which is already populated by other digital players and by startups and by other established organizations. And this is, of course, a key challenge. And we see something like this happening in all kinds of industries. And what we see is that this notion of digital platforms that I was mentioning already several times, that digital platforms form and build ecosystems around them. That's something that we see in many different industries. So here's just a few examples. Again, for these examples, I focus on US or European companies. I'll have an Asian example also later on. Of course, there's many other examples in these different categories, but you're familiar with most of these, I guess. So on the top left, you have gig economy platforms and consumer platforms. This is the platforms that we all know, that we use ourselves, right? On the top right, you see education platforms. That's probably also interesting in your situation. It's also interesting for us at ESSEC, actually, because we're also going through a digital transformation. Natalia was mentioning our online offers earlier, but we also have platform players in this context, such as Coursera or Udemy, and we see a similar platformization happening as in other industries to some extent. And on the top, you see more B2B platforms, such as on the bottom right, you see enterprise software platforms or industry platforms, such as Bosch IoT Suite. I was mentioning Bosch as an example earlier. On the bottom right is enterprise software platforms with SAP or Salesforce, which also market their solutions as platforms for others to connect to and building these ecosystems around organizations. So we see this platformization happening in all kinds of industries, and that's an integral part of the digital transformation of established organizations. So because it's so important, I want to give you a few insights into what platforms are all about. Again, that's topics that we discuss in much detail in my courses, and it's super exciting topics, and we're having great discussions when we do that. So just a little bit of an insight here of what these digital platforms are. And I would like to point you to two important elements of these digital platforms. One is that digital platforms as we say, invert firms, right? They kind of turn firms inside out. So what do we mean by that? Again, I give you an example. What do we mean by that? So this is a classical, it's a taxi, of course. And when you think of a taxi company, a classical taxi company, you see that a taxi company has control over several resources. They may even own some of these resources. They usually have cars, right? They usually have employed drivers. They have licenses, right? And when you compare this with, let's say, Uber as an example of a platform in the same context, we see, and that's interesting, that Uber doesn't have any of these, right? They don't have their own cars. They don't necessarily employ their drivers. In some countries, there's some debates around this, but the general idea is that they bring together drivers and riders. They bring together different user groups, and they don't have the licenses. So they don't have all these resources. And that means that value creation, to a large part in digital platforms, happens outside the organizational boundaries. And that's something that is pretty amazing. That's kind of one part of the virtue of digital platforms, and why they scale so nicely is that they shift value creation outside organizational boundaries. So when you take a taxi company, value creation happens through resources that are part of the organization. And that's not the case for digital platforms, where value creation is shifted outside firm boundaries. We see the same for, let's say, Airbnb. Airbnb is a huge provider in the accommodation industry without owning any of the buildings where the rooms are that are rented out, right? It's the same idea of inverting the firm, shifting value creation outside the organizational boundaries. And then there's another important element of digital platforms, which is that digital platforms build on network effects. So that's another critical element of digital platforms. And so what do we mean by that? By network effects, so there's an economic idea that a product or a service, in our case a platform, gets more valuable with the presence of other users of the product, service, or platform, right? So if you take so let's take a non-tech example. If you take a very traditional telephone, like a landline feature telephone, the value of this telephone for one user would be 0 if there was no other user at all, right? So that's a network effect, right? Because the value of the telephone comes from other users also owning telephones and being connected to the network so that we can make phone calls. And we see the same for digital platforms. And what we see often in digital platforms is that we have more than one user group. So we had Uber as an example, or Airbnb. We would have 2 user groups. One user group is the driver or the host. The other user group is the passenger or the guest. And what the platforms do, in this case Uber or Airbnb, is that they bring together these 2 user groups. And these platforms are driven by network effects. In this case, indirect positive network effects to a large extent, in that the platform, Uber or Airbnb, gets more valuable for riders or guests if there are more drivers or hosts, and vice versa, right? So it also gets more valuable for hosts or for drivers if there are more guests or riders. And that's an indirect, what we call an indirect positive network effect. And there's also negative network effects. There's also direct network effects within the user groups, and all that makes digital platforms super complex. But this indirect network effect already shows us how a platform can be very, very successful very quickly by scaling, by bringing in many users. And then it can have a very powerful position, a very strong position, because we have this winner take all or few take all dynamics. At the same time, platforms often fail because they don't find a way to bring these user groups on board, because the value of the platform is hard to sell to user group A if user group B is not there, and it's difficult to sell to user group B if user group A is not there. So we end up in this chicken and egg situation where it's really difficult for platforms to, at the time of platform launch, to get a critical mass of users on board. So that's the idea of network effects. And this, I was just talking about platform launch. This is also relevant for the monetization of platforms. And it's to a large part the reason why platforms can be so successful, and also the reason why platforms often fail, and why this is such a challenging market space to be in. Okay, so this is just, so as I said, we dive in my course, we dive into these concepts and all the specifics of it and the interesting details. But for now, let's leave it there. And so just tell you again, so why is this relevant? We are still in this framework of an established organization being disrupted, facing digital disruption due to new technology. And this is relevant because established organizations like Bosch or like a long-standing car manufacturer have to realize that they are often in platform businesses, that they're part of digital ecosystems. And for being successful, we have to realize that our organization is not a monolithic entity anymore, but boundaries are blurring. We exist in these ecosystems, and we therefore have to understand what the rules of the game are, how this works, and what our role could be to be successful. So that's one element of digital disruption that I wanted to stress at this macro business model level. The other element that I wanted to briefly talk about is digital practices. So what do we mean by digital practices? By digital practices, we mean the operating model of organizations that is changing. And I was mentioning earlier that as organizations are transformed, they often turn into technology companies or software companies, whereas IT or technology used to have a secondary role in the sense of the key goal, the key task of IT was to support business in creating value for our customers. And as organizations shift, as digital technology takes center stage in the organization, more and more organizations try to adopt the digital practices that we already know from technology companies to some extent. And that's the other important element of digital disruption at the micro level. In addition to existing in digital ecosystems, organizations have to adopt digital practices. And again, I would like to talk a bit about digital practices, and I would like to start with an example. So let's think about Ant Financial briefly, that of course you all know very well. So Ant Financial is an example of an organization that is in a platform business, obviously. So we all know that it grew out of the Alibaba's marketplaces, and one of their first services was Alipay. But then gradually, as you know, they have added more and more additional services related to loans, to money market funds, to credit scoring. And what's interesting is that from a platform, from an ecosystem perspective, what Ant Financial has been doing is that they first plugged onto the existing ecosystem around Alibaba's marketplaces. That was the entry point. They had a large user base already. But then increasingly, they use the strong position and the data that they have been able to collect due to their technological capabilities to offer additional services to their clients, right? And keep reusing their capabilities, the data, and their strong network position to offer additional services. And this is part of the reason why they have been successful in doing this. And so it's actually a great example of an organization that is a digital platform. It exists in a digital ecosystem, and at the same time can be a template for established organizations how to implement digital services. So when you think of the architecture for a data-driven organization, such as Ant Financial, what we often see is something like this, where we have a platform, which you see in blue here on the bottom, and we have Agile Teams building on top of that. So Agile Teams is the first element that I want to stress here. As I was saying, Ant Financial keeps reusing elements to offer new services, new innovative services to their customers. And the way they do this is closely related to what we think of when we talk about agility, agile teams. And this is something that I discuss also in detail in my courses. So when we talk about agility, about agile, we distinguish between agile principles, agile methods, and agile practices. So all this comes from software development. Agile principles is the foundations, the ideology of agile, where we talk about a collaborative and iterative approach, where we try to reduce overhead, where we try to focus on customer value and reduce documentation when we develop software, and really focus on creating value as fast as possible, and in an iterative way by getting quick feedback, having this fail fast, learn fast approach. So that's all the foundational principles of agile. And then there's a huge set of agile methods, which in the software development context, for example, includes Scrum, which is a very popular way to develop software, and which works on a certain time interval, where teams work together and decide upfront before the time interval, which is usually like 2 weeks or 4 weeks. They decide upfront what they would like to implement in these 2 weeks or 4 weeks, and then they work on this in this so-called sprint, and they follow a certain set of prescribed meetings to provide value to clients after each one of these sprints and get feedback and implement the feedback. So this is one way of implementing agile ideas in a team context, which is called Scrum. And there's also many others. So design thinking, Natalia was mentioning it earlier, that we have a course where I'm also involved, an online module on design thinking and agile practices. So design thinking is another method that relies on these agile principles. DevOps is another approach, which is closer to bringing together development and operations, which also relies on agile principles. So that's all different agile methods, examples for agile methods. And then when we talk about agile practices, it's even closer to technology, to software development, where we really talk about day-to-day routines of developers in their practice, in their actual software development activities that they follow, which also implement the foundations of agile. So this is something we dive into in quite detail in my course. And what's interesting here is that Ant Financial and other companies do just this, right? They rely on agile teams. They rely very much on these ideas, but they do so based on a foundational platform, right? They, as I was mentioning earlier, they keep reusing the data. They keep reusing their technological capabilities through application programming interfaces that the different teams can plug into. So what's interesting here is that also internally, right? When we think of digital practices, the idea of platforms to some extent comes back, because the agile teams work on the basis of internal digital platforms. And that's interesting also in an agile context, because in agile, what we usually do is we try to, as I said earlier, we try to create value quickly for our clients and not think so much about planning, about documentation, and also about architecture, right? Whereas if we have an internal platform like this, there is at least some upfront architecture work and architectural decisions to create this platform, and what should be part of the platform and what should be left to the teams is an important decision when creating such an operating model. Okay, so this is what I wanted to share with you on how Ant Financial works. This and here's again why this is challenging for established organizations and why it's so important to change practices, to adopt digital practices, is that traditionally established organizations are often organized in silos, and especially when it comes to data-driven business models, when it comes to using data across different organizational units to create value for clients, it's very important to break up these silos and to build these internal platforms that I was mentioning that you've seen in the slide before. All right, so let's go back to this initial question that I had asked, how established organizations can thrive in the context of digital disruption. And we did not go into all details, but I think I gave you an idea of the things that we discuss in my course in the Global MBA on digital disruption. And as I said, we do so we work a lot on different cases, such as the ones that I've shown you now very briefly. We go into all detail of these cases and discuss them in how the ecosystems affect traditional organizations, how traditional established organizations can engage in their agile transformation. And so this is just to sum up what I've mentioned so far, what we've done so far. So how established organizations can thrive in this context of digital disruption is to a large extent by knowing about the mechanisms that drive digital ecosystems, by making smart decisions and placing themselves in the context of these ecosystems, by deciding, for example, if the organization aims to be a platform owner itself, if it aims to complement other platforms, if it aims to be a platform itself, it has to decide about the technological foundation, the interfaces, the product launch, the monetizing structure, decisions related to platform governance, how open the platform should be in terms of should we let everyone participate or should we control access to increase quality, but at the same time make it more difficult to get the network effects going. So you see there's like a myriad of decisions that organizations need to make, questions that need to be answered. And this is exactly the decisions that need to be made to be successful in this context of digital disruption. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we talked about digital practices, where we said that organizations need to engage in agile transformation. They need to break up silos. They need to rely on internal platforms. And on top of that, create agile teams with end-to-end responsibility for certain services, for certain products. Okay, great. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And I hope I could give you an idea of the topics that we discuss and the way we do this. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to ask them. I'd be very happy to answer them.
Hello, Thomas. Thank you. It was very insightful and interesting. Having like different examples and companies that we all know, like it talks more to us. So thank you very much. We do actually have a question from Karen. Do you see that APIs or the subject that you just presented will be taking over human workers?
Well, I mean, that probably speaks to the general question of the relationship between technology and human workers, and especially in the context of artificial intelligence. That's, of course, a very important question. And so that's a very broad question. And the broad answer to this will be no. I don't think that's going to happen. Of course, there's lots of subtleties to this because the things that human workers do will change. And we see a lot of research into the topics of human AI interaction, how human and AI can actually work together to reinforce each other's capabilities in a way. And we also see, and actually the context of software development that I was just mentioning is like a great context to study this, because here we have worked with technology support, technological assistance that are to some extent AI based for a relatively long time. So we see how human workers and technology can actually complement each other. So I think it's not going to take over. I have a very optimistic take on this, or rather optimistic take in the sense that, of course, things are changing. Of course, the capabilities that human workers need to bring in are changing. Some things are less required than before, but there will always be, hopefully, there will always be room for complementing each other.
Thank you. The machines where we pay in the supermarkets, they are the automatic ones, but we still have people working at those payment stations. So
yes, absolutely. But I mean, that might change, right? It's quite likely that at some point we don't have the people working at the cashiers anymore. Maybe there's one person to check if everything works. But then, I mean, yes, so this is the shifts that we see, right? This is happening. This has always happened when technology is introduced, then there's some shifts in what the roles that humans play. And yes, of course, I mean, that's not, AI is not just any technology, right? This is a deeper transformation, a more important one. But still the general mechanisms should still apply, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We do actually have another question from Johnny. How do you think digital transformation knowledge skills can apply in luxury industry companies?
Again, I mean, that's a great question, and that's important, of course, for us in our courses, because we have lots of participants interested in luxury, and we discuss this a lot as examples. So just like any other industry, this is going to be there's digital transformation. This industry is being platformized to some extent. So we often think that in some industries this may be less relevant, but also here we see, I think tomorrow we'll have a talk on NFT in the luxury industry, right? And this is the capabilities that we need. And as soon as we talk about NFTs, metaverse, and that's just one, of course, that's just one part of what luxury companies do, but it's a good example, because again, we clearly see what I was saying just now, that this happens in digital ecosystems, because if you are part of the metaverse, you're not like alone anymore, right? Boundaries are blurring, and at the same time, we need the digital practices to be able to create digital create digital services. So this applies very well to the luxury industry as well. And this notion of NFT is just one example, right? Everything related to our customer interaction, our production, how we advance, how we augment the goods we sell. So even if the good itself may stay physical, there's so much happening around this in the digital context that this applies just as well to this context as well.
Okay, thank you very much for very interesting question as well. We don't have any more questions so far. Oh yes, another question from Facebook. Being an engineer and working in the oil and chemical industry at the moment, what are the skill sets I can acquire from the strategy and digital leadership track that will help me in today's digital revolution?
Okay. So I can speak for my course, and maybe Natalia, I don't know if you have more to share on the program in general. So for my course, that's pretty clear that you can learn a lot, because it's really, so this course is really about, so there's several things here. On the one hand, we really learn, we hands-on knowledge on the technology itself. So you will learn about the technology itself, which makes you more acquainted with this technology and be more confident in working in this context. But more importantly, because the technology has changed, so what's important right now may not be that relevant anymore in a few years from now. May or may not, we sometimes don't know. But in my course, we really talk about the underlying mechanisms, the things that drive transformation, the things that drive digitalization, and having an understanding and appreciation of what's fundamentally different between a digital organization and a traditional organization. This is really the skills that you get, and being able to lead digital transformation and to lead organizations that are active in this context is what you get out of this. And this is, of course, as I was saying, this applies to all industries, including also oil and chemical industry, of course. And actually, in the course, we have many examples of more like asset-intensive industries, and we see that. So we may think that, for example, the platformization that I was mentioning, okay, this relates to things like Uber and Airbnb, and they have their because people have cars and apartments that they can rent out, but this is not going to happen to asset-intensive industries. But that's not the case. We see platformization in asset-intensive industries happening just as well. So it's different, of course, and we go into these details of these differences, but it's still relevant.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question for me as recruiter. What kind of interactions will we have with tech digital companies? Okay, so as I always like to explain to prospects and to candidates, is that an MBA, and Professor Thomas can also add from his point of view, it's not just like, okay, I'm doing a program and like academics and like only going to classes, but I consider it a 360-degree experience in which, yeah, of course you have classes because they are very important and there is very interesting content to see about, well, digital disruption that we just saw, business intelligence, big data, etc. Like those are subjects, especially digital marketing. Those are subjects like special from strategy and digital leadership track. But besides also those subjects, there are, as I said in the beginning, 2 field trips that the participants, they go to different European destinations. And so in order to answer to the question, the participants, they go and visit different companies. So within the tech and digital sector, we do have partnerships and we do go to different sectors, to different companies. London, Luxembourg, and Amsterdam. Those are like hot hubs for this type of companies. So it's that, and also at the end, as I said, there is the Capstone Consulting Project. So that is actually companies, they come to ESSEC and they say, okay, I have like this problematic, this thing that I need to solve. And of course, it will be something related to the subject, related to the track that you will be studying. If you are in the luxury brand management track, then you'll have something related to that. But if you're studying the strategy and digital leadership, then you will have a problematic in order to solve that. So that will be like the exposure that you will have during the program to these kind of companies. And so what I will do is that I put in the chat box to everybody. I think that I will be able to see it. This is my email address. In case you guys who are watching have some questions about Global MBA or any of the programs that I just presented at the very beginning. If some of you are if you have questions about admission or GMAT or anything, feel free to let me know and just drop me an email to jaimemagana@essec.edu, which I just put it in the chat box. I don't know if the person who is helping us with the technical things can maybe post it on Facebook as a comment or something. I don't know how it works, but there you go. And there are no more questions so far, so maybe we are done for today. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Thomas, for this masterclass, and that gives us an insight about digital disruption and a little bit about degustation that we can have for if we join the Global MBA.
Yes, thanks so much, Natalia. My pleasure. Thanks to all of you for joining, for listening. And if you have questions, specific questions for me, feel free to get in touch. I'm happy to discuss.
Thank you.